Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today is time for part 3 of my series responding to a bit of Orange's critique of Berkeley's Evolution 101 website, or part 2b using their numbering system. So if you haven't seen parts 1 or 2a yet, feel free to check them out. Not sure why they called this one 2b, to be honest. I was trying to decide whether to just call mine part 3, since there's nothing that really ties this one to part 2a other than the general overall theme of evolution. I was all like, to be or not to be, that's the question. But that's enough dad humor from me. You'll get plenty of that from this orange guy before long. So on to the video!
Just remember, the stuff presented by this creepy bear is from the Evolution 101 website, written by the Understanding Evolution team. Commentary by Rent-A-Friend2000, that's me!
The central ideas of evolution are that life has a history, it has changed over time, and the different species share common ancestors.
Actually, this is true, and creationists do not disagree with this at all.
So you don't disagree that different species, like, say, chimps and humans, share a common ancestor?
I guess that makes creationists evolutionists.
Yeah, if you accept microevolution, then you're left with two choices. You either A, have to accept macroevolution, or B, demonstrate a mechanism that stops evolution before it can get to the macro level. But since no such mechanism has ever been discovered, we can safely assume that there really is nothing stopping all the centimeters from adding up to a kilometer, to go back to my distance analogy from part 1.
Or maybe they're still failing to define things in a usable way.
Well, I can see that you really don't like broad definitions, even when the definition must cover a broad topic. I'm sure if you took a course on evolutionary biology, it would get much more specific than a website whose goal is to provide a layman with a very basic understanding of this huge subject. And since you're complaining about definitions being useless, I'm going to expect you not to use the word kind, or to give a concrete definition for the word kind if you do decide to use it, for at least the rest of this series.
But I'm no PhD. It's true that different species do have common ancestors. Living things have changed over time. But that isn't evolution in the Darwinian sense.
Doesn't need to be. Evolution itself is just the fact that organisms change through successive generations. Darwinian evolution is just one of several proposed mechanisms for evolution. Specifically, Darwinian evolution is the concept that there will be variations, and that natural selection favors the variations that provide an organism with survival and reproductive advantages. This is one of the generally accepted mechanisms for evolution, but even if it were to be demonstrated to be false, the overall theory of evolution would still stand. Remember Lamarckian evolution? That was the one where an organism would develop the traits during its lifetime that it would pass down to its offspring. For instance, a giraffe may have gotten its long neck as a short-necked animal stretched to reach plants just a bit high for it, making its neck slightly longer, and then having offspring that start with this slightly longer neck, who then stretch their necks. This mechanism has been thoroughly refuted, but there is enough evidence for evolution at this point that the mechanism by which evolution works is relatively unimportant when discussing whether or not evolution happened. Basically, evolution is the what, and Darwinian evolution is the how. We are discussing if the what happened, so to take issue with the how presupposes that the what did in fact happen.
This central idea merely refers to things like the diversity of chickens today coming from fewer species of chickens in the past.
It also covers how chickens today share a common ancestor with all other modern birds, likely something along the lines of Archaeopteryx.
We observe chickens, over time, becoming different chickens. That, my friends, is the biblical story. That is creation. Darwinian evolution requires the blind faith leap of believing all living things have a common ancestor.
Firstly, it's not blind faith, it's where the evidence has pointed. Secondly, when presented with the sentence, "The central ideas of evolution are that life has a history, it has changed over time, and that different species share common ancestors," you said,
Actually, this is true, and creationists do not disagree with this at all.
Here's the image that accompanied the text on that website. Clearly, they aren't talking about variations within one species, your example of the chicken being all various subspecies of Gallus gallus, the red jungle fowl. So are you muddying the waters here on purpose, or are you so blinded by your dogma that you can't even be bothered to respond to what the website's actually saying, instead electing to erect a straw man?
From the chickens of today, back to the first chicken, back to the first bird, back to the first lizard, back to the first fish, back to the first worm, until all the way back at the head of the family is Grandma Rock.
So close and yet so far. It would actually be Grandma Luca. LUCA being an acronym for Last Universal Common Ancestor. Now there is some debate about what exactly LUCA would have been, but it seems likely that it would have been a single-celled organism that used RNA for both genetic information storage and to catalyze chemical reactions. It is likely that it first developed near deep-sea hydrothermal vents.
I smell a serious bait and switch here.
Yeah, you started off talking about a perfectly reasonable, albeit general, line of descent, and then you threw a rock in at the bottom. Now, I hate to break it to you, but no evolutionist believes we evolved from a rock. In fact, if you look at the biblical story, God made man from the dust of the ground, aka dirt. Do you know what dirt's made out of? It's about 25% air, 25% water, 5% organic matter, and 45% mineral matter. What is a mineral, you may ask? It's a solid inorganic substance of natural occurrence. In other words, rocks. So who is it that believes we're descended from rocks? Well, since descent of a species is generally traced through the female line and Eve was made from Adam's rib, then technically we're all descended from a bone that was made from a rock. So as long as we're being glib to score cheap points against each other, allow me to say in the timeless tradition of children everywhere, "Nuh-uh, you think that, not me!"
We observe lots of different dogs descending from some ancestral wolf kind over a few thousand years.
And there it is! Please provide a concrete definition of the word kind. I know you won't really, because if you do, it doesn't matter how you define it, we can then show a transition between one kind and another. So please, no more complaining about how the definition of a broad word like evolution is too broad.
And we observe certain vegetables descending from a common cabbage ancestor over a few thousand years.
But it's like, totes impossible for these things to change any further because reasons.
But to then try and argue that, therefore, wolves and cabbages descended from a common ancestor billions of years ago is, I will argue, stretching the evidence a tad thin.
How many genomes have you sequenced, I wonder? Because literally hundreds of genomes have been sequenced, and this process has helped us place organisms far more accurately on the phylogenetic tree of life. Do you know how they do that? By checking for commonalities. Basically, the more similar an organism is, the closer they are related. Now, there's more to it than that, obviously, but that'll do for now. But for instance, humans and chimps have about 95% identical DNA, depending on how you look at it. Non-coding DNA and duplicated sequences do affect this number, but rest assured, geneticists have accounted for it. In fact, my man-crush Paulogia covered it in more detail in a video from a couple weeks ago. Give it a watch, it really shows the depth of dishonesty found in creationism, linked down below. Humans and mice are about 85% identical when it comes to coding genes, and 50% identical for non-coding genes. Chickens and bananas are roughly 60% identical to humans. This all is, of course, grossly oversimplified, but again, people who study genes and do gene sequencing all day, every day for their careers probably know what they're talking about when they say that certain genetic traits demonstrate common ancestry.
To restate the fact that they are glossing over, evolution needs to demonstrate how bacteria could gain the genetic information to add to their physical complexity until they become everything from wolves to cabbage.
Which is something you might learn about in an actual course on evolutionary biology. It also covers it a bit later on the website, though not in great detail. Now, I would agree that this is something that the website doesn't cover very well. It doesn't really specify the specific mechanisms which are responsible for adding material into the genetic code. It goes more for the method of lumping these mechanisms in with the mutations category. But again, the goal of the website is to leave you with a basic understanding of how evolution works. You don't need to know all of the specifics for that purpose.
To give you a metaphor, imagine you have 8 popsicle sticks and a bottle of glue. You have the instructions for making a picture frame. What I want you to build is the Starship Enterprise, not a model of it, the real thing.
This might be a decent analogy if you included the fact that you have about 3.5 billion years in which to do it, and you're allowed to collect other supplies from your environment and experiment to see what works and what doesn't. Still pretty far from a good analogy, but I've made it a little better for you.
What kind of information would you need to add to your instructions in order to fly me someplace no man has gone before? Quite a bit, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. And assuming that the physics aren't impossible, which they may well be, and also assuming that this is being done by an intelligent human, since you're giving the popsicle sticks to a person rather than letting natural forces do the work, then 3.5 billion years should be sufficient to develop the technology needed to build the Enterprise. Personally, I'm more of a fan of the monkeys in a room with a bunch of keyboards with the goal of typing the complete works of Shakespeare. Then we can picture natural selection as a force that keeps a word or sentence that would be correct and discards the random gibberish that is otherwise typed. Given enough time with natural selection working, it is inevitable that the monkeys will type out Shakespeare's works. That's basically how evolution and natural selection work, except for the fact that there is no mind behind the selection pressures and there is no end goal apart from reproduction.
You might need Mom to drive you to Home Depot more than once before you get that accomplished. Also, each step along the way has to be functional, or the entire process stops.
Yes, but what function? Things change function all the time with evolution. In fact, there's even a name for it. It's called exaptation. In fact, when you Google the word exaptation, one of the top results is from the very website that you're critiquing. There are plenty of examples. Feathers probably originally evolved purely for heat regulation. Now they're pretty important for flight. All vertebrates have sutures in their skull that allow the skull to grow. Mammals have adapted this feature to allow the skull to compress during birth to allow the baby to gestate in the safety of its mother's womb for longer. Genetic material left behind by viruses has been repurposed and is now essential to the gestation process in mammals. In fact, this is not only a good example of exaptation, but an excellent example of convergent evolution, as the genetic material is used to create a protein that's only found in the placenta called syncytin, I think I'm going with. Primates all have two types of syncytin, labeled 1 and 2. The material for this protein likely came from a virus that infected the common ancestor of primates, hence why we all produce the same two types of syncytin. In 2005, they found that mice also produce syncytin, but slightly different forms than primates, and this form was able to be traced back to a different virus. Mouse syncytin was labeled A and B. But then in 2009, they found yet another variation of the syncytin gene from yet another virus, this time in rabbits, and this time it's labeled syncytin ori1. Then they found yet another version of syncytin produced by members of the carnivora order, caused by yet another virus. This one is labeled syncytin car1. So not only is this genetic material that has changed function, it is a change that has been adapted independently at least 4 separate times.
As a similar metaphor, imagine trying to turn a single prop engine plane into a Boeing 747 while it's in flight, with small successive modifications.
Why does it have to stay in flight? I mean, there have been trillions of generations between all the species that are alive today and Luca. Each generation could count as a pit stop, and at some stops the flight aspect is taken away while it makes for a serviceable car until it can get to the next pit stop. Stop making me fix your analogies. You're pretty bad at them and they end up being super awkward.
Keep in mind that it needs to keep flying, or you all die.
No, it can land to have the work done and continue on the ground if the work leaves it temporarily unable to fly. Remember, when traits evolve, the new traits don't have to be perfect right from the get-go. A flatworm's eye spots don't see in any detail, just the difference between light and dark. But that is much more useful than not having any eyes, so it's easy to see how that would be selected for, especially for the first organism to develop them.
Oh, and you're blindfolded. And you don't know that you're trying to make a 747.
Oh, so you do know that evolution has no goals. That kind of flies in the face of what you said in part 1, doesn't it? I mean, going back to that example, your one-legged dog Lil Brother was a failed offspring. So again, to add another patch of duct tape and try and patch up your horrible analogy, there are billions of these planes flying, and they all have people working to turn them into planes that fly better. And what counts as better can change depending on the situation, some needing to carry more cargo, others needing to carry more passengers, others needing to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible, and so on. Eventually, given enough time and removing the caveat that they must always be in flight, which never made sense to begin with, at least one of them will come out looking like a 747 eventually. But even if it isn't identical, as you're pointing out here, evolution has no goals, so it still works.
Are you starting to see what creationists mean when we say that all life is too complex to evolve by chance?
Yeah, you mean you don't personally understand, therefore it's impossible. That's the message I'm getting here. Well, here's a revelation for you. I don't completely understand it either, but I didn't decide in advance that it can't happen just because I don't get it. You know why? It's because I know that there are lots of things that I don't understand that do happen. I mean, I don't understand how a flat-screen TV could possibly control how each little tiny pixel changes color individually in order to produce a lovely 4K image. Does that mean that flat-screen 4K TVs are impossible? Well, the brand new 50-inch 4K TV in my basement would say no.
Because if not, I can keep cranking out metaphors.
I doubt it. You could barely manage the ones you did, and they were completely wrong. Also, just a minor technical point, but you seem to be under the impression that a metaphor is just a fancy word for comparison. It's not. In order for your analogy to have been a metaphor, you would have had to say something along the lines of, evolution is a process by which you build the Starship Enterprise using nothing but popsicle sticks and glue, or evolution turns a single prop plane into a 747 while in flight. So there, I'm fixing it for you again.
The evolutionary story from start to finish is like turning a popsicle stick picture frame into the Enterprise.
Well, now that you've put the word like in there, it's a simile. Try and keep it straight, would you? Also, you really felt the need to explain that? You seriously have that little respect for your audience that you don't think they would have been able to figure that out for themselves? And remember, the main target audience for creationist material are people who are either already Christian but accept evolution and they're trying to convince them that evolution's fake, or they are fellow creationists who need material like this to squish their doubts back down. So the people making this creationist material don't think that the other creationists are intelligent enough to have figured out that analogy all by themselves.
Only, the tools and materials, and the increase in information, are made by a blind, accidental process with no mind, purpose, or goals, and the end product is far more complex than a simple starship.
You don't really know much about physics if you think that faster-than-light interstellar travel is simpler than life on this planet. At this point, I think it'd be helpful to have a working definition of complexity, as it can mean different things in different contexts. I mean, complexity is often a relative term, meaning that something is complex when compared to something else. For instance, the ragtime music you have playing is quite simple when compared to something like Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, but when compared to the songs my kid's piano teacher sends home to practice, ragtime music is hugely complex. So depending on what grounds we're using for comparison, basically anything could be called infinitely complex. Also, keep in mind that part of a working Starship Enterprise is a transporter that is capable of recreating life forms in their entirety, complete with all their memories up until the moment of transport. So a working Enterprise has the ability to essentially create life, so it is now impossible for this life to be more complex than the Enterprise. So when you're saying that life is more complex than the Enterprise, what reference point are you using?
Keep all that in mind, because they're about to teach us how it's done!
Yep, that's right. We know quite a bit about how evolution has and continues to work. But you feel incredulous when told about it, so it must be a lie.
Here, you can explore how evolutionary change and evolutionary relationships are represented in family trees.
What text-to-speech software are you using that screwed up the word family into famila? That's just weird.
How these trees are constructed, and how this knowledge affects biological classification. You will also find a timeline of evolutionary history and information on some specific events in the history of life, human evolution and the origin of life.
It's rare to find, but occasionally a book will have the courage to label the spaces on a chart like this to designate the difference between the animal we know to exist or have existed and the ones we have to assume for the sake of the chart.
I don't see any assumed animals. I see animals grouped together by certain characteristics, such as amniotic egg and hair. To help you understand, those spots on the chart represent where those particular characteristics were first developed. They aren't tied specifically to any single animal, as we will likely never be able to say with 100% certainty which animal was the first to develop a trait, because there will always be the possibility of an animal from earlier in the same time period which developed that trait just a smidge sooner than the one that we know.
In short, when you take away all of the imaginary friends, all of those horizontal lines magically go away.
Let's look at that chart again, shall we? Down at the bottom we see the word vertebrae, as in all the animals above it on the chart have vertebrae. Do you disagree with that statement? But then off to the side there's another section of animals which falls under the category of vertebrae, or well, rather over it with the way the chart's oriented. These are animals with bony skeletons as opposed to cartilage. Do you disagree that all the animals connected to the bony skeleton category have bony skeletons? Next up comes four limbs. Try to keep up now. We're at animals that all have vertebrae, bony skeletons, and four limbs. Do you disagree that any of the creatures above the four limbs label in the chart have four limbs? The next group has a title that I would slightly disagree with, just a minor technical point. Instead of saying amniotic eggs, it should just say amniotes, as it is a category of animals that all nurture their infants in amniotic fluid, whether that be an egg laid on land or a fertilized egg retained within the mother. I mean, it's still an egg either way, and an amniotic one at that, but it just adds in needless confusion. But again, are you disagreeing that these creatures have vertebrae, bony skeletons, four limbs, and reproduce in an amniotic fashion? Do you get it yet? This is not a list of heredity, where the vertebrates begat bony skeletons which begat four-limbed animals, and so on. This is literally just grouping of animals based on what traits they have. You can draw that line from rodents straight down, not connecting it to any other animals at all if you like, but that doesn't change the fact that rats still have backbones, bony skeletons, forelimbs, are amniotes, and have hair, as do all other animals contained in the mammal category, including humans, by the way.
For those of you who are slow on the uptake, that means all of those T intersections and the transitional ancestor they represent don't exist either.
Did you seriously just try to say that bony skeletons don't exist? Or vertebrates? How ridiculous is that?
Which should lead you to ask, what's the point of this chart then?
Well, let's go back and see what you made the creepy bear say about the chart, shall we?
Here, you can explore how evolutionary change and evolutionary relationships are represented in family trees, how these trees are constructed, and how this knowledge affects biological classification.
Oh, I see. It's a chart about biological classification. In other words, a chart where animals are classified based on the traits that they display. So while there will probably be a common ancestor at each spot where the tree branches, that's not actually what the chart is about. It's simply about grouping animals together based on shared traits. Now the question becomes, did you honestly misunderstand that whole section, or are you purposely misrepresenting it? I do prefer to give people the benefit of the doubt, but the more of your material I watch, the harder it is for me to believe that this is simply a case of misguided ignorance.
Which is my point exactly.
So your point exactly is to misrepresent what the chart says with the hopes that it can be dismissed, and that the huge amount of evidence for evolution that can be found in morphology alone should just be thrown out based on this misrepresentation. Well, that's all he does here, so remember to follow me on Twitter and support me on Patreon. See you next time for part 3, which is actually part 4. I'm still not sure why they did 2A and 2B.